Good evening and welcome to Australian Democracy in 2013, brought to you by the Wheeler Centre. I'm Peter Mayers and it's my pleasure to host this conversation. 6 big thinkers with big ideas about what democracy is, or perhaps what it should be, in Australia today. I'd like to acknowledge that we meet on the lands of the Kulin Nation, traditional owners of this place known to us today as Melbourne, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present. An acknowledgement of country is a reminder that our concepts of what it means to be democratic evolve with time. Australian colonies were some of the first places to extend the franchise, the vote, to all adult men, regardless of whether or not they owned property. South Australia followed closely behind New Zealand in extending the vote to women. Indeed, it went even further. It allowed women to also run for office. So from 1895 onwards, all men and women aged over 21 could fully participate in elections, even Aboriginal Australians. In many other parts of Australia, however, this wasn't the case. In WA and Queensland, laws were passed to prevent Aborigines from voting. And indeed, in the year after Federation, in 1902, the Federal Parliament did the same. The Commonwealth Franchise Act of 1902 excluded any Aboriginal native of Australia from voting. Indigenous Australians weren't fully enfranchised until 1962. So democracy is an evolving thing, and it's about much more, of course, than casting a ballot, about more than giving citizens the power to swap one brand of politicians for another. A fair society, a democratic and just society, a representative and accountable government requires a democratic culture where fundamental rights are respected and can be upheld by an affordable legal system and independent courts, where vigorous media organisations speak truth to power and where public servants offer frank and fearless advice. So how do we measure that? That's what our 6 speakers tonight are going to tell us. I'm going to invite them one by one to come and speak to you. I'm going to introduce them as they come up. I'm going to keep them to time. I've got a little bell here. It's going to be a bit like those party political announcements at election time when, after the news. I don't even know if they still have them, but limited time so that we've got time to hear from you in the audience and for you to ask questions. But I'd like you to join me now in welcoming our 6 speakers: Jane Smith, Humphrey McQueen, James Button, Meg Simons, Margaret Simons, Anne Summers and Con Karapaginiadis. And Margaret Simons is going to speak first. Margaret is Director of the Centre for Advanced Journalism at the University of Melbourne and coordinator of its new Masters program. She's an award-winning journalist and author who writes on media for Crikey. She's published 10 books, including most recently Journalism at the Crossroads, and she's currently working on a biography of the media proprietor Kerry Stokes. Margaret Simons.
Well, good evening, everyone. It's great to be here, though a little daunting to be first. I'm a journalist by background, and obviously my main interest in the topic that we're discussing tonight is that awkward dance between my profession and the professional politician. A sideshow is what Lindsay Tanner called it. He blamed mainly the media. I think most journalists would blame mainly the politicians. The truth is that they're both locked in, as I say, an awkward dance, which neither seems to be able and perhaps not willing to break free from. One of the great luxuries of a job at a university is that you have the time and space to think about how things might be done differently. And the main thing I want to talk about tonight is a project that we've initiated at the Centre called the Citizens' Agenda, which is about exactly that, trying to think through how things might be done differently with these wonderful new tools that we have, surely the best that any human society has ever had for sharing news and information and ideas, including news, information and ideas about who we might want to govern us. The term Citizens' Agenda has quite a long tradition. The American journalism academic Jay Rosen founded the public journalism movement in the late 1980s and early 1990s before the impact of the internet on media. His idea or his concern was that people were turning off mainstream media largely because they were always proposing problems or highlighting problems without suggesting solutions or even offering much of a pathway towards finding a solution. And he suggested that the media should conceive its role as being a public forum in which people could meet and discuss their common concerns and begin to work out solutions to problems, both reporting on that process but also fostering it, holding town hall meetings, for example, at which issues could be discussed. It was a movement that attracted an enormous following in the States at its time, but Rosen these days says that it has been overtaken by the internet because the public have actually arrived in the middle of the newsmaking process, like it or not. It is no longer a matter of the media necessarily needing to foster that. When he visited Australia last, it was during the 2010 election campaign, and he proposed a different form of, if you like, public journalism, which he used the term the citizen's agenda, suggesting that media outlets should use all their resources, both the conventional ones and the new ones, if you like, to determine what the citizens wanted the election to be about. Not just who they're going to vote for, which is a comparatively arid question, I would suggest, but what issues did they want the candidates to be addressing and talking about as they vied for votes. And he suggested that once this citizens' agenda of issues had been determined, the media outlet should be steered by it, that they should devote resources to reporting those issues, to advancing that agenda, whether or not the politicians wished to talk about it. I've found that an incredibly exciting idea, but although Rosen has been talking about it for quite a while, no media outlet, either in the States or here, has really given it a fair trial. And that's really the initial idea behind our Citizens' Agenda project. What we're doing is that in 10 electorates in this election campaign, we've contracted with the participatory democracy organisation Our Say to conduct a social media intervention. We've chosen the 10 electorates to, broadly speaking, reflect the diversity of the nation. So, for example, one of them is the seat of Melbourne. That is our most inner urban seat and, of course, currently held by a Green. We also have at the other end of the spectrum the electorate of Grey in South Australia, which is one of the biggest in the nation, certainly one of the most remote, stretching from the Nullarbor to the Simpson Desert, taking in the Iron Triangle of Port Pirie, Whyalla and Port Augusta and towns such as Cooper Pedy, for example, and just about everything in between. I can run through the whole list of electorates. The Our Say website is open at the moment. We opened it early in May. And on it, people can log on and ask a question, say what question they would like the candidates in that electorate to address. And during the last couple of the weeks of the election campaign, we will be holding actual town hall meetings, physical town hall meetings, at which the candidates will be present and at which the questions which have been voted to the top of the Our Say exercise will be asked. So you can log on to the website, you can ask a question, you can comment on somebody else's question, and you get 7 votes in your electorate to vote for the question which you most want to see the candidates address. Our research questions include whether this improves or alters people's sense of engagement and agency and political power, but also whether by making a citizens' agenda visible, we change the way that journalists do their work. Will journalists pay attention to this citizens' agenda as well as or instead of the agendas that are being put about by the political parties? As I say, the sites have been open for a while now, and those of you who live in one of our target electorates are, of course, encouraged to log on and ask a question or vote for somebody else's question. At the moment in Melbourne, for your interest, we have the agreed participation of both the incumbent Adam Bant and Kath Botel, who's standing for Labor. We have 39 questions on the site at the moment and a total of 1,044 votes, and that's with the site having been open a little over 4 weeks. The top question at the moment concerns art and music education. That has 221 votes, closely followed by a question about asylum seekers at 211 votes, followed by grazing and mining in national parks, 196 votes, and student transport concessions, which of course is a state issue, but that's at 140 votes. If I turn to Grey, the other electorate, the top questions there concern the lack of things for young people to do in Port Pirie, but quickly turn into issues such as Indigenous health, mental health in remote areas, and the future for coal mining industries and mining industries more generally due to climate change. So we're already beginning to see quite a diversity of questions. We won't know whether we're going to be able to say with authority that this has altered things for quite a while. But perhaps just to conclude, I would say that the last huge technological innovation in communications that human societies lived through was the invention of the Gutenberg printing press. And without that, modern democratic forms would not be possible. And in fact, in some ways, you could see those forms as being a side effect of that technological innovation. I believe we're now living through at least the equivalent in innovation. We have to expect it to change or impact upon all the things that the printing press impacted on, which, if you think about it for a few moments, is just about everything. I think it will change democracy. It could destroy democracy, but certainly it will change it. What I'm hoping is that the citizens' agenda might point some ways towards improving it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Margaret Simons. Con Karapanagiotidis is OAM, is a lawyer, a social worker and a teacher, and the founder of the Asylum Seeker Resource Centre. He founded it in 2001. As the child of a working-class Greek family, his passion for human rights grew out of his personal experiences of racism and from witnessing the exploitation of his parents in factories. Con has been recognised for his work with the Asylum Seeker Resource Centre as a finalist for the Australian of the Year in Victoria, as being voted one of Australia's 20 unsung heroes and one of Melbourne's 100 most influential people. Con.
I have to warn you, I'm highly likely to swear during this conversation. So what does democracy mean to you? What does it mean to me? How do we breathe it in? How do we live it? How do we taste it? How do we feel it? How do we experience it? Let's talk about it like it's a human being, because at the best of times, that's what it is. Democracy is the ability for us to be fully realised as a people, as a community, from the family unit to broader society, to the room right here. We're a heaving mass of humanity carrying all our bullshit and issues, but at the heart of it, a yearning desire to be free. A yearning desire to be able to experience that freedom in every possible way. From what I'm wearing, to what I'm saying, to what I'm preaching, to what I'm fighting for, to what I'm listening to what I'm standing for, to what I'm willing to risk everything for. Democracy at its essence is messy, it's passionate, it's primal, it's at the heart of what makes us human. The ability to be free. So I work with asylum seekers, some 10,000 since I started the Asylum Seeker Resource Centre. They're rarely talked about in the way that they should be. I have seen no greater champions of democracy than refugees. People who will fight with everything just to taste it for a moment. People who will risk everything to stand in its shadow and its glory for a second. Extraordinary women from Afghanistan that are willing to risk rape and torture because they think that they're equal of a man. Amazing activists right now in Iran risking everything because they want to write the written word as it should be in its most pure and truest form. Human rights heroes from everywhere, from Palestine to Iraq to Zimbabwe, you name it, we have them coming to our shores. People that I feel blessed to have met because they are true human rights defenders. They are people who yearn for a moment, for a second, to experience that democracy. What I would give, Con, they say to me, to be free. I'm not going to probably see it in this lifetime, but I want my children to taste it. I want my children to grow up free of war and conflict and oppression. These extraordinary, resilient, courageous people actually want to grasp on to the promise of democracy, to come to a country that espouses that and yet robs them of it at every moment. The theme of my talk, which I'm talking about as I'm figuring it out as I go along, is the idea of how our leaders have killed democracy for asylum seekers. They've robbed them of it. They've destroyed it. They've stolen it from them in every possible way. I look at the last week, 55 people dying at sea, 13 people floating in the waters, their bodies rotting. No one's going to bury them. Government decided it wasn't worth their time to collect those bodies. We're sending a message. This is what democracy will look like for you. should you want to share in ours. 1,632 children being robbed of their freedom, of their childhood, being raised to be traumatized adults. This is what democracy is going to look like for you. Learn it at a young age in this country. We deny 7,263 living, breathing human beings, mothers, fathers, brothers, sisters, the right to work in this damn country of ours. Living on $3, $4 a day. I was having someone tell me today about people living 17 to a house, a woman 5 months pregnant sleeping on a bare floor, a man working for $4 an hour, cash in hand, being exploited. This is what democracy looks like in this country. I look at our country excising our nation, excising it from the Refugee Convention. 19,760 people without the right to seek protection in this nation. The only country in the bloody world that has done that. I sit there and get told it's for their own good. We're the chosen ones, me and you. We deserve it, we own it. And yet we're a nation of boat people on Indigenous land. But I'm special and so are you. I didn't fight for it, I didn't struggle for it, but that democracy, I want it all. I can't share that, you can't have that, it's mine. You want to taste it with me? For your own good, I'm going to send you to Nauru. I'm going to send you to Manus Island where you can miscarriage in the midst of that malaria that I'll leave you in for the next 5 fucking years. I told you I would swear. We're going to keep you in detention centers for years on end until you're so decimated that there's nothing left of you. We're going to create a third world country in the richest country on earth so that you are so broken and extinguished of the hope of democracy and a moment of that freedom that we will defeat you. We will sit there and cry crocodile tears, telling you how terrible it is when you die at sea, and yet we will champion the turning back the boats to camps where they'll be tortured and prisons like the 300 plus in the Ngombo prison in Sri Lanka right now that we sent back to be tortured for their own good. That's what we're going to teach people. That's what we're doing in this nation, right here, right now. And I say to people, if you're going to turn back the boats, you might as well stand up and champion, let them drown in the sea. And I get that every day. Let them drown, let us feed them to the dogs, let's burn them, let's shoot them. And I ask people, what are you teaching your children when it comes to democracy? What are you teaching your family? What are you teaching your community? Is this us at our best? Is this it? So full of greed for our own selfishness, in fact, recognizing nothing about the fact that as a community, our freedom and democracy is a damn lottery. We won the random lottery to be born here, or to come here at a time where we saw refugees and migrants as something important and special. But there is hope. And that hope is in us as community, taking back our democracy step by step, conversation by conversation, person by person, and going, we've had enough of failed leadership. The crisis is not in the next person getting onto a boat, wanting that democracy like me and you. It is the failure of leadership in this country. And we need to take that back. We need to own it. We need to say, well, what is this country at its best? What is it capable of? What is its full potential if we are a democratic society that everyone shares in it or no one does? Because it ain't worth shit without that. Thank you.
Thank you, Con Karapanagiotis. Jane Smith is our next speaker. Jane is the inaugural director of the Museum of Australian Democracy at Eureka, which opened last month in Ballarat. Jane brings a wealth of experience to that job, having previously been CEO of the New Zealand Film and TV Office, an industry advisor to a federal minister, a corporate strategist for the ABC, and having worked with new democracies in post-apartheid South Africa, in Cambodia and Hungary. Jane Smith.
Good evening. We know from the 2012 research by the Lowy Institute that democracy has become a dirty word, particularly for the under 30s. Only 39% of 18 to 29-year-olds think democracy is preferable to any other kind of government. 23% of that age group think that it doesn't matter what kind of government we have. ABC research says that of the 1.5 million unregistered adults in Australia to vote, 70% of them are under 25. One of the first schools we had through MAID answered the question of the day in our exhibition space, which is, do you feel you're listened to? 90% of them said no. They were 11 and 12-year-olds. Why are we failing young people in making a connection to the fundamentals of our society? I heard Robin Archer speak recently about how people thought they didn't engage with the arts. And she said how every day we get up, we put on clothes, we read a book, we read a newspaper, watch film, listen to music and so on. All of that is the arts. And I think that democracy is integral to our lives, but we just don't appreciate it. So the equivalent of democracy is that every day we have access to government-funded services, an ability to speak our minds on issues, certainly to criticise governments, a strong questioning media, and a police and a judiciary which will take action if someone misbehaves. So how do we reframe democracy outside of voting and bring back the focus back to equality, human rights, access and inclusion? MAID goes back to the meaning of the Greek word people plus power equals democracy. It's built around a value set of inclusiveness and diversity, openness and transparency, collaboration and reciprocity, generosity and tolerance. MAID is a new concept of a museum. It has some iconic objects, the Eureka flag and the Ballarat Reform League Charter, but its collection is mainly digital. It uses art and the latest technology to elicit an emotional and sensory experience to get people to think about their world differently. MAID has both a physical and a digital space, especially in social media. We see democracy being about embracing diverse views, finding common ground and agreement on ways to act. MAID was conceived to encourage national conversations about what democracy means in the 21st century. By taking the history and the spirit of the Eureka Stockade, often seen as the beginning of Australia's democracy, MAID gets Australians to think about what democracy means to them personally. Touchscreens that behave like iPads and animation are used to allow people to have their own curated experience through Eureka's history from the 1850s. At Eureka, a group of young people, aged 16 to 27, decided to take a stand against injustice. The gold licence fees were very high and had to be paid regardless of whether you found any gold. The diggers came together, swore an oath, wrote a list of demands, which became the Ballarat Reform League Charter, raised the flag of the Southern Cross, the Eureka flag. They didn't want to pay taxes if they couldn't vote. No taxation without representation was their catchcry. The day after the stockade, where 30 people died, a commission was appointed to investigate what had happened. The media of the day supported the diggers and was critical of the colonial administration. So when the 13 diggers were brought to trial the following year in the treason trials, they were all acquitted. The Commission's report basically accepted the demands of the Ballarat Reform League, and Victoria was the first place to deliver male suffrage in the British Empire. The Eureka Stockade leader, Peter Lawler, was elected to government straight away. We've been working with MTV, who have done the most extensive research on the millennial generation, the 18 to 30-year-olds, who are Australia's future decision makers and leaders. Millennials see themselves as tolerant, curious, sharing, flexible and optimistic. 84% of them think that they have the potential to make the world a better place. 73% think that access to the internet has changed the way they think about the world. This generation is a global generation in a way not like others before them. They've seen and used social media as a driving force for change, such as with the Arab Spring. Their digital world is borderless. The millennials see success as being happy, part of a loving family and having a job you enjoy. The key influences for them are family, friends, themselves, celebrity and sports stars, and politicians are actually the least important. The millennials' value set does resonate with those who believe in democracy. However, there's clearly a communication, branding and participation gap there. What can we learn from the under-30s to show us a new way to do democracy differently? MAID's approach to contemporary democracy is that we focus on individuals, their family, friends and communities. This dovetails into the under-30 view of the world, but also the community focus that is being carried out by many organisations, especially in the social entrepreneur space. Tim Costello from World Vision talks about the role of democracy in the 15-year programs that they set up in different countries. Initially, it's about medicine for the sick, then education, then it becomes about the style of government. And he sees democracy as crucial to sustainability. The ability to have a secret ballot, called an Aussie ballot in some parts of the world, is crucial to good government. Secret ballots came from the demands in the Ballarat Reform League Charter. How we connect with the under-30s is a priority with MAID, and we're developing a number of programs and partnerships to do this. We have the Eureka flag at MAID, which is one of Australia's most treasured objects, beautiful and fragile, a powerful symbol and a possible metaphor for Australian democracy. So the key lessons for MAID's role in democracy in 2013 are: what lessons can we learn from the under-30s about how they operate in a seamless digital physical world? How do we harness their energy and savvy from campaigns to make the world a better place? How does MAID connect with school children and the citizenship and history curricula? Overall, MAID is going to use ideas and creative technology to find community champions and leaders, to amplify their stories and examples, to inspire Australians to appreciate why democracy matters. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane. Jane Smith, the Director of the Museum of Australian Democracy at Eureka, or MAID. James Button is Communications Manager at the Grattan Institute here in Melbourne and a former journalist with The Age. He worked at The Age for 20 years, during which time he served as a Europe correspondent as well as in senior editorial positions, and won 2 Walkley Awards for his feature work. James was also briefly a speechwriter for Prime Minister Kevin Rudd in 2009, an experience recounted in his terrific book Speechless, A Year in My Father's Business. Though it's not a book about Kevin, it's a study of politics and the public service and a book about fathers and sons. James Button.
Thank you very much, Peter. As Peter said, I was a journalist for a long time, and then I had this very brief stint in Canberra, 16 months. So I'd been a sort of outsider looking in, and I had this time as an insider looking out. And I thought I'd just share a couple of things that I learnt there and how they reflect on the state of our democracy. I do think we have a problem in our democracy. There is an inside world. There is the Canberra world, which is fascinating and lively, and there are great debates within it. But that inside world has stopped talking somehow to the outside world, which is the public, Australia. And the consequences of that, I think, are potentially very serious. And I just want to go through 7 sort of categories of people who are players in this world quickly, and just talk about each of them and how it impacts on the quality of our debate. The first are members of Parliament. I think we have seen over time a decline in the quality of and experience of our MPs. The pool of people in Australian society from whom MPs are chosen is shrinking, and the jobs, the professions that MPs come from is also shrinking. You don't have the farmers and teachers and doctors and trade unionists who came up through the ranks of working trade unions. Instead, on the Labor side, and it's reflected in a different way on the Liberal side, but on the Labor side you have increasingly this system where people get involved in student politics. They select themselves as politically interested. They then go into either a trade union job, but not as a job as someone who's come up through the rank and file, but someone who's dropped into that trade union. Or they work as for an electoral officer, they become an advisor, and eventually, if they play their cards right, they get pre-selection for a seat. The problem with that system, and there are many problems with it, but one key one is that it's very internally focused. People are focused on getting that pre-selection, and so things become settled inside the party. In the case of the Labor Party, one thing that really strikes me about the ALP is that it no longer conducts its debates in public as it used to do. And so what happens is, one consequence of that, and you see it in the current government, I think, is that issues are dropped on the public. So the things that might be very good policy or not, but there's no longer a debate. The mining tax, I think a good policy, but dropped on the public without debate. The media law reforms recently, the electoral funding, again, no debate, just something that was sort of settled internally. And I think that's a function of the change inside the ALP and the way that it is no longer a party of open argument as it used to be. The second group I quickly discuss are political staffers. They've increased hugely in numbers. You don't hear much about them, but they're very important. They're the people who advise ministers. Now, they've probably doubled in number. In the time of Paul Keating, there were 230. Now there are 430. But they are not picked necessarily, and less they're picked for their policy skills, but for their ability to manage the media cycle, or because they are part of the reward and patronage system that attaches to these two political parties these days. Is that the bell? Oh no, oh my God, I'm in number two. Now, in the past, what happened with policy is that it tended to be developed first inside the public service, and then the staffers would comment on the political implications of policy. Increasingly, policy is devised by staffers because ministers are so busy that they can't do many things, and it falls to the staffers to devise it, people who are often young, inexperienced, and that in relationship with the public service, the public service is very important. We don't hear anything about it, but it really matters in a democracy. If you think about the GFC, Australia's excellent response to the GFC was really because the public servants who remembered the lessons of the 1991 recession gave advice to the government to do particular things, that they had the corporate memory. So if you just have staffers who are young, 30-year-olds, who haven't got that experience, and if the public service is sidelined, as they are in some areas, you have a real problem with the way that policy is developed. Now, the fourth area is the media. Meg talked about the dance. I think it's a really good metaphor for the sort of toxic dance that's happened between our politicians and our media. And in a weird way, the decline in quality of politicians is reflected in the media. There's a decline in quality and experience there as well. The pool is shrinking. There are cuts to mainstream media organisations, so they don't have the money to fund serious policy work. I don't think there's the interest either. And weirdly, both the media and politicians are obsessed with opinion polls, and that's part of the dance. So one thing that struck me recently, The Age, on the day that Julia Gillard launched her Gonski, the education plan, The Age ran the 198th in a row poll about her standing. It's been going on for about a year or more, and the Gonski report's a very important piece of public policy that was put on page 4. It was very disappointing. I think that Meg, you talked about the fragmentation of the media. I think that is still something that's playing out, but is definitely having a really big impact on the engagement of the public with our politics. Business. At the moment, perhaps because of the disengagement of the media and of the general public, and I'll come to that in a minute, vested interests are very powerful in Canberra again. The Labor government's carbon price in 2009 was ferociously opposed by business, and they got a lot of what they wanted. The mining tax, absolutely, fierce, hostile campaign, and there was a back down on that tax as well because the mining industry objected so powerfully with so much money behind it. Gambling reform, media law, again, there's a huge business and its representatives are very active in Canberra at the moment, in large part because they see they can get somewhere, that the government is prepared to concede important ground. Our academics, unfortunately, with some notable exceptions, I think have switched off from being involved in and engaged with complex, difficult areas of public policy. I think it's a long-standing problem, but it's something that I think is also affecting public debate. And finally, out of all this is the public. And we live in a country that is extremely affluent, and a lot of our problems to outsiders seem rather small. But perhaps that affluence has contributed to, I think, a a turning off from politics. But it's also, I think, the problems I've sketched I don't think politics and what is going on there is being clearly explained to people at all. So I think that dance really plays out in a disengaged public, and the more the public is disengaged, the more the problems that I've sketched are magnified. And I think a classic example of that is climate change, where it's a complex issue, it's a vital issue, and yet for some reason our politics just cannot seem to solve it, or even address it in any way. It's insidious. You can't see it happen. The government, which I think did a terrific job eventually. Julia Gillard did a very fine job on producing a carbon tax, but they've walked away from it. They have not. They rarely speak about this policy now, and it's a real pity because it's unpopular. But sometimes you have to do unpopular things in politics, and that seems to have been forgotten as well. I still think that people, while being switched off, people still believe in politics. There is still a craving for leaders who will speak clearly to them, who will tell them frankly what the problems are, who will praise what the other side does when they do it well. There is an opening for leaders and for politicians, as there has always been. So it's not all lost, but there are certainly plenty of problems at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you, James Button. Humphrey McQueen is a freelance historian and cultural commentator, widely known through his books, his work on radio, his articles and public speeches. He's written about 25 books, or maybe 26 by now, ranging across history, the media, politics and visual arts. And Humphrey's latest two works deal with the history of builders, labourers and their unions, Framework of Flesh and We Built This Country. Humphrey McQueen.
Thanks very much, Peter, and doubly thanks for the invitation to be here, because it's given me a chance to catch up with old friends, both on the platform and around the city. The second reason I'm grateful to be here is that I hope that somebody in the audience will be able to help me solve a problem I've had for the last 20 years. As an undergraduate, I read a lot of George Orwell, and I thought from that I remembered Orwell saying something about democracy in particular. When I went back to look for it in the essays and elsewhere, I couldn't find it. Even Dr. Google has not been able to solve this little problem for me. So you're my last hope. If somebody here can't come up to me afterwards and tell me where I might have read this in Orwell, I'll give up looking. And what I'm looking for, I remembered his having said, was fascists say that democracy is a bourgeois fraud. A socialist knows that bourgeois democracy is a fraud. Now, the question then is, why do socialists think that bourgeois democracy is a fraud? And Orwell's answer, and mine, would be because of what it leaves out. There is no industrial democracy and no real economic democracy. And without those two things, political democracy and parliamentary democracy will remain hollow. What is it about industrial democracy that is so important? Well, Sir Samuel Griffith, who drafted the Constitution and went on to become the first Chief Justice, in 1888 said that it was notorious that there was no freedom of contract between the worker and the employer. And the reason for that, he said, was that the employer class continued to accumulate all the wealth in the society, whereas the workers had nothing to sell but their capacity to add to the wealth of the employers, and that it needed a radical transformation of the economic system to deal with that aspect of industrial democracy. What we now find, of course, is that the admirers of Griffith today want us to believe that if an unskilled cleaning woman, say, for a multinational corporation, is deprived, as they would say, of a union, by a union, of her right to negotiate an individual workplace contract with BHP through their lawyers such as Freehills, then this is an infringement of her freedom. That's what it's been turned around into. But the other aspect of industrial democracy that is vital, of course, is health and safety on work sites, which was why the battle here at GrowCon to get union reps to be able to stop the job when it was dangerous, as we're now seeing yet again over asbestos. These are the daily aspects of industrial democracy that make it so vital, and yet we see less and less of it today. On the question of economic democracy, there's one way in which I can put this to you fairly clearly. Between 2007 and 2010, the US investment house BlackRock purchased 11% of the shares in the 128 largest corporations operating in Australia as measured by revenue. I have yet to speak to anyone who knew that. You weren't asked to vote for it in the 2007 election, it wasn't raised in the 2010 election, and I haven't heard it being discussed in the 3-year campaign that has gone on since 2010. Perhaps the reason is that it's commercial in confidence. The other aspect of democracy, though, to make industrial and economic and political democracy real, I believe, is that it must be participatory. And in a real example that I can give of this is that many councils years ago voted to go nuclear free. The Eurobodalla Shire Council, however, down the south coast of New South Wales, I think had a better idea. Instead of getting the councillors to vote, they put it to a plebiscite of all the voters. They won to go nuclear free, but in my view, it would have even been good had they lost because they'd campaigned. They'd involved everybody. An education campaign had gone on. So that democracy and organising for these ideals is as much a part of learning if you are one of the advocates as it is if you're one of the people to whom the advocacy is being directed. Now, I have to admit that these notions of industrial, economic and participatory democracy are not as widespread in the community as they once were. Indeed, when I was in Broken Hill 5 years ago, I consulted the Lonely Planet Guide, only to discover that its editors can't get their heads around the notion of social democracy. Broken Hill since 1904 has had a club called the Social Democratic Club. This is so remote now from the political life of our country that the Lonely Planet tells us that this is the Social and Democratic Club. Now, it is all those things, but it is still a radical political socialist-based organisation. And indeed, social democracy and economic and industrial democracy are not entirely underground at Broken Hill, as is witnessed by the fact that it has a newspaper that is not owned by Mass Murdoch. It is owned by the Barrier Industrial Council. Now, Murdoch, of course, gave up his Australian citizenship and his right to vote in order to own television stations in the United States. That has never stopped him having more influence over the political life of Australia than anyone who's been elected to any of the parliaments in this country. The free press that we do have was won in London, for a start, by printing workers who went to jail in their hundreds by selling and printing newspapers that did not conform with what was called the Stamp Act, which was a way of suppressing the press by putting a great charge upon it. That was followed in Australia at the same time, in fact, by convict editors who went to jail here in the 1820s. And one of them continued to edit the newspaper from his prison cell. This tradition is carried on today, I'm pleased to say, by Bradley Manning, by this wonderful young man from the National Security Agency. But, you don't have to worry about that because for more than 40 years, the CIA has been sucking up your telephone calls through Pine Gap. So they didn't need this latest method of being able to do it. So what do I think we need to deal with this? From my perspective, what we need, and what I try and advocate whenever I can, is a red armband view of Australian history. Now, the red armband view could have three great pillars to be memorised by in relation to democracy. One of them, or two of them as a pair, are the defeat of the conscription plebiscites in 1916 and 1917, and the other is the defeat of the bill to ban the Communist Party in 1951. Australian society would have been completely different had either of those bits of legislation gone through. Would have been a much more controlled, censored, dominated society had they gone through. We're spending millions at the moment to commemorate the failed invasion of Turkey. These three pillars of Australian democracy are either suppressed or at best marginalised. Museums that should be giving us some sense of this, the Museum of Democracy in Canberra deals only with the parliamentary, with what the Bulletin in its wicked days used to call the National Gasworks. The National Portrait Gallery opened without an image of a trade unionist. And of course, the National Museum in Canberra was being censored from the right even before it opened. Now, I began with what I suspect might be a putative quotation from George Orwell, but I want to end with a quotation that I can trace to a footnote. The statement made by the organiser for the Builders' Labourers in Hobart in 1916, a wonderful man called Samuel Champ, who used to recite poetry at trade union congresses. The failure to do that, I think, tells us a great deal about what's gone wrong in the labour movement. But Sam, speaking in the Domain in 1916, said, "Our liberties were not won by mining magnates and stock exchange jobbers, but by genuine men and women of the working class movement who died on gallows, rotted in dungeons, to be buried in nameless graves. It is to those men and women that we owe the liberties we enjoy today." When Sam's words are chiselled over the portals of a museum to democracy, we'll know it is not a fraud. I thank you.
Humphrey McQueen, thank you. Our final speaker is Dr. Anne Summers AO, a best-selling author and journalist with a long career in politics, in public service, in the media, in business and in the non-government sector in Australia and internationally. She's one of Australia's leading thinkers and has written many influential books, from the classic Damn Whores and God's Police, first published in 1975, to her latest, just released and very timely volume, The Misogyny Factor. Anne Summers.
Thank you. Well, it's very nice to be here, and thank you very much for inviting me. And I too am very pleased to be able to catch up with one old friend, Humphrey McQueen, because I remember when I was writing my first book, Damned Whores and God's Police, and I'd never written a book before, and I had no idea how to go about all this historical work. Humphrey was a great encouragement to me in terms of not only giving me practical advice about how you actually do history and how you learn things, but also in some of the other aspects of writing, how you actually write a book, who you're talking to, who your audience is. And I think he put me onto some of Orwell's writings, were very helpful to me back then. I'm obviously going to be talking to you today this evening about the extent to which women are fully participating in Australian democracy, and I'm talking about parliamentary democracy, not other forms of democracy. Obviously, Australian women have the right to vote, and as far as I know, do vote in equal numbers to men, but that's about where it stops. And when it comes to our representation in all areas of Australian life, but especially in politics, our record is not so good. And what I was going to talk to you about tonight was the basic argument of this book, The Misogyny Factor, which has just been mentioned, which is a book premised on a question, and the question that I ask is, why is it that 40 years after Gough Whitlam put equality of the sexes onto the national agenda of this country, that we still don't have it? Why have we fallen so far short, despite all the legislative and other efforts that have been made? But I probably won't even get to talking about the book, because all the arguments I made in this 180 odd pages have actually been summarised and illustrated in the last 24 hours in a far more graphic fashion than I could possibly have dreamt up or reported. When the Prime Minister gave her speech the other day to the Women for Gillard event, I got a copy of the transcript of the speech later on that day and I read it and I thought, okay, yeah, fair, okay, right. Then this morning when I woke up and read the newspaper articles about the response to the speech, I was actually quite astonished. The Prime Minister made 3 basic points in her speech. One is that that if there is a change of government, there is a risk that all of the reforms for women that Labor has introduced over the years could be in jeopardy. And she says Labor is the party of women, and many of the great reforms from equal pay to sex discrimination legislation and so on have been introduced by Labor, and that she herself is a product of Labor, that would be in jeopardy. Secondly, she said that the voices of women would be banished from political life, that the blue ties would be taking over. And the third point she made was that abortion would again become the political plaything of men, and that we ought to be very mindful of the fact that if there was a change of government, our abortion rights could be at risk. And when I looked at the media coverage this morning of that speech, I saw it described as desperate, ill-advised, stupid, wrong, all kinds of negative descriptions, and I thought, well, I'm astonished that such a sort of bland, basic speech could be described in that way. But I was even more astonished by the people who were making these comments, and they were all so-called feminists. They were all women, and they were all women whose names I'm not going to mention here tonight. And apparently last night there was a big event in Sydney around the book Destroy the Joint, which is an anthology, as we all know, of articles written around that concept of destroying the joint. Very useful political concept, I think, and I'm fully into destroying the joint at the moment. The joint that's been so unfair to so many people in this country, and all those bits of it that don't work need to be destroyed. But I would have thought that an event attended by, run by and spoken to by feminists about destroying the joint would have found some good things to say about the Prime Minister's speech, but I was wrong. And of course the media was delighted to hear all these feminists attacking the first female Prime Minister, so it was all full bore this morning in the paper until, lo and behold, about 7 o'clock this morning on Twitter, somebody published a copy of that menu in which the Prime Minister was described, as I don't probably need to tell any of you here tonight, how she was described in the menu for a fundraising dinner in Malbrough's, in the area where he wants to be re-elected. And so the whole thing changed immediately. And people even somebody wrote in Crikey today, well, I was going to write a speech attacking her, but now I won't because she's been called nasty names. I mean, people, where have you been? This has been the basic proposition for the entire time that she's been Prime Minister, and what her being Prime Minister has merely revealed is the extent and depth of the sexism and misogyny that exists in our culture. And, we like to think, or some of us like to think, I certainly like to think, at the when we've got our first female Prime Minister, for whatever shortcomings she might have, what things you disagree with about her, and there are many, the fact that we have finally broken that barrier would seem to be a good thing. But I was amazed to see that it actually, rather than it being a sign of our progress, it was a sign of how far we had to go, and the sort of sexism and misogyny that was unleashed around her, and which I have documented extensively, was evidence of the fact that we have a very long way to go when it comes to reaching equality in this country. And I just wanted to mention a couple of sort of basic facts and figures. So when Julia Gillard says that women will be banished from political life in this country if there's a change of government, and that the blue ties will be back in charge, I just want to give you a couple of examples of what I took her to mean. She didn't say this, but I've done the figures and I just want to share them with you. The Gillard government, the Gillard cabinet, the outer ministry and the parliamentary secretaries in the Gillard government, there are 42 people in her government, of whom 14 are women, which equals 33%. In her cabinet of 20 people, there are 4, which is 20%. So 42 people in the Gillard government, 14 of them women, 33%. Very high in the Western world. When we come to the Abbott front bench, his cabinet has 20, his outer ministry has 12, and he has 15 parliamentary secretaries, an unbelievable number. 47 people altogether in his alternative government, of whom 9 are women, a mere 19%. So you can see there'll be an immediate drop in women's representation in the higher levels of government, or in the actual levels of ministry and cabinet, if there were to be a change of government. The blue ties would definitely be back in charge. And even they like to point to the fact that there is a deputy, Julie Bishop, deputy of the Liberal Party. Well, she, of course, will not be the deputy prime minister. That will go to Warren Truss. I think there are other figures I could mention, but I don't have time, just showing the way in which the numbers of women in Parliament, low as it is, it's 28% at the moment, is dropping. It dropped at the last election, and it will drop further, and I imagine significantly so at the coming election. In the Queensland election in 2012, Queensland went overnight from having the highest number of women MPs in this country at 38% to the lowest at 28%, and I could expect some similar results here. So what do I conclude from this? I think that if we're serious about giving women equal representation in this country, in the political system, and I think we need to do that in order to ensure that the right sorts of policies flow from our representation and that women's interests are adequately represented, I think we need to have 50% quotas for all parliamentary positions. And I can't see it happening in a hurry, but I think it needs to happen. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ann Summers. Now we have a couple of microphones, a couple of ushers. If you've got a question, go to the usher. Come on, don't be shy, up you get. You're not going to get another chance. We've only got a little bit of time. We're going to go a bit over time too because, well, I didn't ring my bell. I should have, but the speeches were too interesting, so I didn't. Okay, question. Yes, take the first question, and I will ring the bell if the question goes on too long.
Yeah, my question is to the panel generally. Given we have this two-party preferred system of government, I want you to react to the proposition that we as a nation have this peculiar form of democracy and voting system where out of the 13 million people that voted in the last election, half of those votes were never counted. Half of those votes were put aside because they were in electorates where each of the candidates won on primary votes alone. So therefore, the rest of these votes were never used and helped to actually elect somebody. And I think that is a huge shortcoming in democracy, and we are one of the few countries in the world, in the Western world, that have such an antiquated, undemocratic system.
So you would, I presume your suggestion was to have some sort of proportional representation or something like that, but I'll invite responses from the panel. You've got to grab the microphone, one of you here, and respond. It's not for me to answer the question. Okay, we'll take another question. And we'll take it as a comment, another question. Yep.
A few of the panellists referred to the fact that our politicians and the media are a bit deficient in terms of the way they serve democracy. I'm more interested in how we build a sort of electorate that would be insulated from those failings and would still be able to make the sort of choices that would progress our democracy.
How do we build our political capacity as citizens? Okay, yep. Margaret, go for it.
Okay, well, I think, no one answer, there is no one answer to that question. But I think we need to be deeply concerned about a situation in which large proportions of the electorate would say, I'm not interested in politics, or I don't bother to follow it. In fact, of course, if you scratch the surface of that, you'll often find they might not be interested in politics as it is reported in the media, but they are interested in what's happening in the local school and the local hospital and all that sort of thing, and that is actually politics in the broad. So I think one of the new missions for journalists, particularly in the new media interactive world, is to make apparent the connections, or only connect, as Ian Forster once would have said, what happens at the school or the hospital to what's happening in Canberra, rather than this ceaseless and really fairly boring concentration on personalities and individuals. That's one of the pieces of thinking behind the project I described earlier, to try and increase, or to see if we can use social media to increase a real sense of political engagement by giving people that sense of agency may or may not work. That wouldn't be a research project if we already knew the answers.
Okay, other responses? Yep, it's working, don't worry.
Is that working? Yes.
No, it is.
I guess this is perhaps an old-fashioned response, but I still think people need to get involved in political parties. I think that part of the reason why our political parties are poor is that people have given up on them. There are understandable reasons why they have, but I think if you're interested in politics, then there is a range of parties that you should consider joining and trying to change and getting your friends and other people to join. I still think that, in a system like Australia's, that way is one of the, it's not the only way. Meg mentioned journalism, and there might be other ways through specific issues people get involved, but I still think those parties, I'm on the Labor side, I think if you care about the things that, or there are things that you want Labor to care about, you should try to join, and I hope that if I don't want this to happen, but if Labor loses very badly in September, that will actually trigger a quite sort of radical response amongst people to say, well, we just can't let this party, go drifting as it's been for so long, that people outside it who are sympathetic will actually say, well, I'm going to get involved.
My idea that that 50% of all seats be reserved for women would require some pretty major changes to the way in which we conduct our elections at the moment. We're clearly not going to get that via the political parties as they are presently constituted, or as one can even envisage them evolving in the near future. So I think it needs to have organisations that put pressure on the parties and pressure on the system itself to change it. So that implies a revived and vibrant movement of women and those who support women in this goal of 50%.
As Margaret said, I think the opportunities of identifying issues that actually resonate with communities and then getting those issues discussed is really the way where you start building it up from the grassroots. And, maybe it's like the good old days when political parties did actually do those kinds of things, but I think that's the only way we're going to see a change.
Yes, hi. I was wondering if the panel had heard about the New Democracy Foundation, which is using citizen juries to try and assist in policy development.
Margaret?
Yes, in fact, I've had meetings with the New Democracy Foundation to discuss my project as well. I think what they're doing is very interesting. It's another model. I think what we share is a feeling that democracy, as it's currently constructed, needs help if it's to survive and evolve. I personally have some reservations about the jury system, which are probably too lengthy and complex to go into at a function like this. And I think they have some reservations about what I'm doing as well, but we certainly had some interesting discussions around that.
Okay, we have another question, I think. Gentleman here.
I just want to expand a point which was just a little bit touched on when we talked about the universities. We seem now the only pillars of our democracy are the politicians and the media, and we talked about the dance. But say 10 or 15 years ago, we had a whole series of public institutions. The ABC, the universities, environmental departments in state and federal government, CSIRO, a massive hooray. Over the last 15 years, they have been privatised and corporatised and silenced. So how do we get the democracy back in our major institutions, not just media and politicians?
As someone who's
Well,
been...
one of the institutions, of course, that you didn't mention was trade unions. And the reason there is still a Great Barrier Reef is that in 1970, the trade union movement in Queensland banned any exploration on it. That would be illegal today under the ALP government. They would be fined $1 million per union and about $7,000 per unionist for every day. So if you want to know why people are not engaged in the kind of actions they were in 40 years ago, you need to think about those things as well. The other problem in the trade union movement, of course, is that you now have many trade union officials who are more frightened of their members than they are of the boss class. And that you have a situation where almost none of the officials are elected by the rank and file anymore, only the executives, and they then choose everybody else to work for them. And that, I think, has had a disastrous effect in most of the unions and the possibility for activism around it. My wish list compared to Anne's fantasy, what about, immediately, getting the 50%, is I think the best thing that could happen would be if Abbott were to introduce a law that forbade trade unions affiliating with the ALP. Because what we're told is that the unions dominate the ALP. The reverse is the case. It is the ALP politics that takes up and wastes the time of union officials, about 80% of which is spent on ALP faction fights, instead of organising their members and getting involved and getting people actively operating out there on job sites. We saw the great success of the campaign against work choices. That, I think, is the great encouragement to us as to what we're going to need to do in the next 2 or 3 years. It was so strong, of course, that Howard had to back off and change the law even before he lost his seat.
Another question.
I'd like to thank Humphrey for bringing to the fore some of those stories from the past about alternative models of democratic protest and other ways of doing democracy. And I'd like to ask you, and perhaps Anne as well, given that what you've said is some of these examples from the past have been suppressed and certainly sublimated, whether you can see ways of bringing those stories into the present in ways that might be enlightening or even inspiring to, say, for example, Jane's millennials.
Anne, you want to?
I think the way we do this is through alternative media, and as Margaret has pointed out, we have so many forms of communication at our disposal these days that cost nothing or cost next to nothing, and which are in themselves a democratising force, something that I've certainly personally taken advantage of and created my own digital magazine, Anne Summers Reports. Please go online and subscribe, it's free. And you can do things that the rest of the media just ignores, and I think that there are so many ventures like that starting up at the moment and energising people and exciting people and telling stories that exist in our society which are completely ignored by the mainstream media, which has such a limited repertoire of interests that have and are decreasingly of relevance to so many of us, even though I still write for them. So I think that I'm quite hopeful about the fact there are alternative ways of expressing this.
If I could just have a bash at that and also just link to the previous question. We do still have quite a lot of the institutions that the previous questioner was asking about. We do still have universities. That's why I'm able to do what I'm doing, because I've got a job at a university. We do still have the CSIRO, we do still have the ABC, and et cetera, et cetera. It would be wrong to think that we need to take them back, 20 or 30 years. They must evolve. We live in an incredibly fast-changing world, particularly in the field of communications and politics. So they must evolve, but we all should be thinking about healthy ways of evolving them and protecting them, but not protecting them to freeze them in aspect.
Thanks.
Yes.
Democracy means politics, and politics costs money. About 2 weeks ago, we had a model about to go through Parliament to fund politicians. Yet we woke up in the morning and found it was just chucked out. Does anybody want to comment on what happened there?
Someone's got to have an opinion.
I'll have a bit of a crack. I think, as I said before, it's a really important issue, this issue of public funding. It has there's a good idea behind it, which is that if you have public funding of parties, then private funding is pushed to the sidelines. And we've seen in America the insidious effects of huge amounts of private funding. But the problem was, I think, that there was no debate. I think that was one of the really big problems. So when opposition, I don't mean the federal opposition, but when there was resistance to the ideas, and clearly there were parts of it that hadn't been thought through very well at all. And it did appear, Gary Gray, who was the minister advocating it for the government, he was very candid of saying that, that one of the things that was behind it was that the Labor Party, and this comes back to your point, Humphrey, about the problems between the Labor Party and the ALP, and the trade union movement. And I think there is an argument for some kind of perhaps friendly divorce or something, perhaps for both sides' benefit. But he said, we are too reliant as a party on just a few sources of funding. So by virtue of it being a poor debate, the public weren't given the opportunity to really have their say. And as soon as that resistance happened, the government backed down very quickly. I think that was the problem.
But the first thing the Rudd government did when it came into office in 2007 was produce a green paper on electoral reform. That was John Faulkner who did it. The ideas were out there, and 5 years later, it just hasn't happened. Margaret, did you want to,
So I'll just say that if they introduced increased public funding and at the same time introduced extremely strict limits on the level of private funding, that's something I could wholeheartedly support. But to have it both ways, I think, might be the worst of both worlds.
And that was the whole idea of what Faulkner and others were trying to do at the start of the Rudd government. Any final comments from the panel? Something you haven't got off your chest? Con? I knew it.
Look, I'll just say this as a final thing, which is, why there's hope for democracy? Because people actually want to have hope, and people want to be inspired, and we can build it. If you're wondering where it is in your community, you need to be asking yourself, why aren't you leading that? Why aren't you nurturing that? Why aren't you moulding that? Why aren't you inspiring that? And that's the greatest lie we're told, is that we're not powerful, and we're extraordinarily powerful. And people are just looking for that. So go ahead and do it.
Thank you all for your attendance here this evening on a cold, wet Melbourne night. It shows that people care about democracy. Please join me again in thanking our panellists.